Hey guys, Levi here and welcome to the second video of the Albion Online Weapon Overview series. In this series we will go over each one of the 15 weapon masteries you can progress in, with today's mastery being the Axe. With each one of the 15 masteries having 7 specializations, we are looking at a total of 105 different weapons you can choose from, which is a pretty overwhelming amount of choices. So in this series the goal is to provide useful information you can learn from that will help you make your decisions. To help you navigate, I've put a bunch of timestamps below in case you are only interested in specific parts. But if you are interested in this specific weapon tree, I recommend you watch the entire video. If you do end up liking this video, consider subscribing, which is free and supports the channel. If you wish to support this channel even further, you can do this through Patreon. More information about that in the description below. I feel like the Axe tree is one that has a really dedicated group of people that play it. And because of that, there is no other type of player that scares me more than those that use the Axe. After all, the Axes do put a ton of pressure on anyone in the enemy group with their insane AoE DPS that's done through sheer damage and multiple damage over time skills in the form of bleeds. So if you are looking for a melee class that can dish out some heavy damage and keep the pressure up with dots, the Axes might just be the weapon for you. The Axe tree includes the Great Axe, which is considered one of, if not the best fame farming weapon in the game. With the introduction of the corrupted dungeons, the bear paws have also become a popular choice for clearing monsters. However, the rest of the Axes aren't really played in PvE as much. Compared to swords, the Axes tend to have much more specific purposes to them. So although the Great Axe is amazing for PvE, you don't really ever see it in PvP. The reason for this is that the special skill of the Great Axe is easily interrupted. Therefore, for PvP, you take one of the Axes with you that are designed for the specific type of PvP content which you are about to do. I think the Axes are a great pick for beginners to get started with farming fame in solo dungeons. If you decide you want to become an Axe main, however, do note that you will have to level up multiple Axes so you can effectively do the different types of content within the game. I also do think the entry level of the Axes for PvP is slightly higher than the swords, meaning it's more difficult to start doing PvP with Axes compared to swords. Nonetheless, at higher levels, I do believe the Axes have a much easier time, as their playstyle is more consistent, in which it's always about pressure. So the most important thing will be knowing which enemies you have to put pressure on and how long you can keep doing that for before you have to retreat to your team. You will always be a DPS as an Axe player in whatever party you play or whatever type of content you do. You will mostly also have some sustain in your build through items such as the Helion jacket or the Mercenary jacket, or build yourself to be quite tanky with items such as the Scholar Cowl or Soldier Armor. You can see the different skills and passives you unlock as you level up the mastery, and within this I think the most important one to mention is the one you unlock at level 70, which is Raging Blades. Getting to 70, however, will take some time for newer players, therefore I suggest until then you use Adrenaline Boost in PvE and PvP, which all the Axes have unlocked by default. Another worthy mention is the Internal Bleeding skill, which you unlock at level 40, which is a more situational but a very effective skill as well. One interesting thing about dots in the Axe tree is that you can have as many as 4 active at the same time through your weapon alone. If you take the Carrion Collar for example, you can have a bleed on your passive, Q, W and E, which are all different from each other, making for 4 different dots that take the health of your enemies away simultaneously. And although the Axe tree has quite some damage to dish out, it will mostly be about the bleeds you apply. Now there are a bunch of things that counter your bleeds, such as the Guardian Helmet, which removes all dots on the person that uses it, and 4 allies within range. Another counter you have to be very careful of is Reflect. So as you enter the more competitive areas in the game, you will have to manage your bleeds more carefully. At the very same time, there are also skills that give you an advantage for having dots, such as the Bloodlust skill of the Mercenary jacket, which heals you every time you do damage. And since multiple of your dots tick on the enemy every second, this can make for some rapid healing. There are 3 Q skills on the Axes, which are the Rending Strike, Rending Spin and Rending Rage. All 3 of these apply the same bleed dot that stacks up to 3 times, and at the max stacks of 3 reduces the enemy's healing received by 20%. Each stack of course also increases the damage of the bleed, and every time you reapply the 3rd stack, the healing reduction will be reapplied as well. Therefore, it's very important you try to keep the stacks maxed on your enemies at all times. On your Q, you almost always want to be on the second one, the Rending Spin, which is an AoE. This skill swings the axe around you, dealing damage to every one hit, and applies 1 bleed stack to each one of the enemies. If the enemies are at least 3 meters away, this skill will also do additional damage, which is very important. It will take some practice to get a feel for what 3 meters is, but once you master it, your damage output and chances of winning will become noticeably higher. The first Q, Rending Strike, is only ever really used in 1 versus 1 PvP situations where you go head to head with your enemy, and even then, most of the time, you will want to use the second Q instead. It really depends on the matchup, therefore I do recommend you start off with the second Q, even in 1 versus 1s, until you know when the Rending Strike will benefit you more. As for the third Q, Rending Rage, there is a bit of mechanics to it, and it is the only Q skill with mobility for the axes. You first swing it twice, dealing damage with each hit, and upon the 3rd swing you jump to an area where you once again deal damage to any of the targets hit and root everyone for a short duration. So if you are in a matchup where you really need additional mobility, it could be good to use Rending Rage. However, it is a pretty new skill, and new uses for this skill might still be discovered in the future. Right now it's not being used much because of the stand time, which makes your character stand still for a short duration after every swing. Nonetheless, because of the mobility, it's still a viable pick. In case all the information about the Q skills did overwhelm you, I personally recommend beginners to stick to the second Q for the majority of the time and for all the different content, until you understand what the other 2 Q skills are capable of. I'll now explain what each one of the W skills do and in what situation they are good to use based on their popularity. Starting with the most popular one, which is Raging Blades, which just might be one of the best AoE damage W skills in the game. It has a pretty low cooldown with only 12 seconds, and it also increases your damage by up to 40%. It is a skill you want to use as often as possible in PvE, as it makes for great clearing, but also to keep up the pressure on your enemies in PvP. Because of the high energy cost, in combination with low cooldown however, you do want to have energy regen in your build, which you will most likely have through a Scholar Cowl or Limhurst Cape. The second most popular W is Adrenaline Boost. This skill provides mobility in the form of a 50% movement speed boost for 5 seconds and also increases your damage by 25%. And since you have it unlocked by default, it's a great go-to until you unlock Raging Blades. The movement speed boost is just very nice to have, both in PvE and PvP, as mobility is king in PvP, and more mobility in PvE means you go through the dungeons much faster. It's the default skill to use in 1 versus 1 fights in the corrupted dungeons, as you can decide to engage or disengage with this skill and control the battle that way. Up next is the Internal Bleeding skill, which is a situational but very effective skill. It is an AoE damage and dot skill that deals a substantial amount of bleed damage every second, but only if your targets are moving. Since this skill lasts 8 seconds and only has 15 seconds cooldown, the dot has an uptime of more than its half-life. This skill is great against targets that try to kite you or targets that try to run away from you, such as when you are ganking in the open world. Due to the fact it's only effective if your targets are moving, this skill does have a bit of difficulty to it, in which you need to set up a situation in which you force your targets to move. Then there's Battle Rush, which you don't ever really see being used, but I do think there is value in this skill. The idea is that you either rush to an enemy and decrease healing received for him and everyone around him by 20%, or rush to an ally and increase the healing received for him and everyone around him by 20%. It could be a great tool to easily kill a target because they can't be healed for as much as they would be normally. However, I do think any of the 3 skills before this one provide much more overall value, mainly due to the high cooldown Battle Rush has. And finally, Deadly Chop, which is a single target skill that does damage and reduces the resistances of the enemy hit. The only place you might want to use the skill is when you are facing difficult bosses and don't have access to Raging Blades yet. But even then, I don't think it's worth swapping from Adrenaline Boost to Deadly Chop, as there's already a damage bonus in Adrenaline Boost. But it could provide value for you, so if you ever do face a tough boss, you might want to try the skill out and see what it can do for you. All of the axes have the same 4 passives. Deep Cuts makes for extra dot damage on the enemy, and because of this makes skills like the Bloodlust on the Mercenary Jacket even more effective. If you want extra DPS through your passive, Deep Cuts is one of the 2 options you could go for. The other passive that provides extra DPS is Aggressive Rush, which increases all your damage by 8% for 3 seconds every 4 normal attacks. Since this buff affects all your skills and outgoing damage within those 3 seconds, it can make for more DPS than Deep Cuts. I would say this passive is the go-to for overall content. Then you have Increased Defense, which increases your resistances every 5 normal attacks. From my experience, this passive is never used. And finally, Life Leech, which is a lifesteal that converts 15% of the damage you do with your normal hits into HP. It could be easy to read over the normal hit part, so I strongly emphasize that it's only basic attacks and not any of your skills that will heal you. This one is really good to use when you are fighting tough bosses in PvE, where every bit of healing counts. So unless you need lifesteal for tough bosses in PvE, or the extra dot from Deep Cuts, you will want to be on Aggressive Rush for the majority of the time. And now we will go over the 7 different axes, starting with the most popular one, which is the Great Axe. The Great Axe is very popular because of being one of the best weapons for clearing solo dungeons. Perhaps it even is the best weapon for clearing solo dungeons. And since you can do this with a very cheap build, and very effectively, even as a beginner, it's very favored. I do have a guide on the Great Axe in which I explain everything about it, so if you want to watch that one next, you can find it in the description below. The E-skill makes you spin like a whirlwind for 5 seconds and does damage every 0.5 seconds to all enemies around you. Something that people often overlook is that it also provides a movement speed buff during the channel. This weapon is also used in group PvE such as the Avalonian raids and group dungeons, which isn't always as obvious to people. This weapon just has a ton of AoE damage, and as long as the E doesn't get interrupted, it's a nice addition to any PvE group. However, do note that I'm strictly talking about pure PvE content. As soon as you want to go to the Roads of Avalon to clear chests with your friends, where you might have PvP contact, you do not want to take the Great Axe with you. Although the Great Axe also deals insane damage in PvP, the spin is just very easily interrupted. So I recommend you do not bring the Great Axe to any type of PvP content. Just enjoy bruising through PvE with it, and that's about it. The Realmbreaker is the newest axe, which was introduced with the Rise of Avalon update and quickly became enormously popular amongst the axes. The Realmbreaker looks very cool, but what it is capable of is even cooler. The E-skill is a jump that does high AoE damage to targets hit and expands into a large cone behind your destination, which knocks your targets up and reduces their health by 20% for 5 seconds. This is a very high impact skill that makes any target's hit weaker and more vulnerable for your allies to easily clean up. It is a very good pick for group PvP content such as the 5 vs 5 and 20 vs 20 Crystal League, Roads of Avalon, Arena, Hellgates, Faction Warfare, and even ZVZ. Overall, a very good weapon for most content the game has to offer. The only downside to it is the price, since it is the most expensive axe by far. So if you do enjoy group PvP and can afford it, the Realmbreaker is a very good choice to invest in. The Bear Paws are one I always found scary to play against because it's a weapon that really adds to the pressure which axes already provide by default. With the E-skill, Razor Cut, you can jump towards your enemies, and aside from dealing damage, you will also apply a bleed dot, which is true damage, meaning it ignores any type of resistances the enemies have. This weapon is often combined with the Mercenary Jacket and Spectre Hood to have insane amounts of sustain and mobility within the Corrupted Dungeons. Aside from the Corrupted Dungeons, it's pretty much good in any type of content. It's like the Carving Sword of the axes, I would say, in which you can use it for a big variety of content, although it's quickly replaced by other axes that fill a specific need much better. So if you want an axe with mobility and strong AoE damage, that's good for any type of PvE content, and the majority of PvP content, you might want to level up the bear paws. The halberd is the OG ZVZ and group PvP weapon within the axe tree. Although the Realmbreaker took away from the halberd's popularity, it's still being played in all types of PvP content, ranging from small scale to large scale. The E skill, Tear Apart, spreads all the random bleed stacks on any of the enemies to all other enemies hit, making for a lot of bleed and chaos wherever you take this axe. Because of this, it just really emphasizes what the axes are about, which is pressure. To make optimal use of the E skill, you want to make sure you use it after you have 3 stacks of bleed on at least one of the enemies within the group you are targeting. It's a great weapon to take if you go to content where there's a mix of PvE and PvP, such as the Roads of Avalon. The only content where this weapon falls short is 1 vs 1 and 2 vs 2, such as the Corrupted Dungeons and Hellgates. But anything beyond that, such as 5 vs 5 Hellgates, Arena, Crystal League, Open World, Faction Warfare and ZVZ, the halberd is just really great to have. Amongst the axes, it's also not the most optimal to do solo dungeons with, and you're better off leveling it in a group setting. The Battle Axe is the only one-handed axe within this weapon tree. The Mistcaller, Torch, Musak and most of the shields are viable offhands that you can take with it. It's a great weapon for 1 vs 1 fights, such as in the Corrupted Dungeons, since the E-skill Vampiric Strike heals you for the amount of damage you do, based on the amount of bleed stacks you have active on an enemy. It's 30% for 1 stack, 60% for 2 stacks, and 100% for 3 stacks, so most optimally you do want to use it when you have 3 stacks active. Do note that the damage output of the skill will always be the same, and it's not affected by the amount of stacks. Although the damage of the E skill isn't great, it does provide a big sustain, which is just a very big advantage in a 1 vs 1. Outside of 1 vs 1, however, I can't really see this weapon being used. Although people might come with new uses for this weapon later on, for now it's strictly a Corrupted Dungeon weapon and nothing more. It's also nice to bring a Battle Axe and Mistcaller with you whenever you farm solo dungeons with the Great Axe, in case you walk into tough bosses where the sustain of the Battle Axe can prove to be very useful. Now the Carrion Collar, which from my knowledge is a weapon that jumps back and forth in being meta based on the patch notes. The E skill is called Morgana Raven, and when you use it, you send a raven in a straight line that deals a bit of damage to all enemies hit. Those that are hit also receive a bleed, which aside from doing dot damage, also reduces their healing received by 30%. And the heal reduction is exactly what this weapon is about. It's a weapon that's very popular in coordinated 5 vs 5 content, such as Hellgates and the Crystal League. Although Arena also is 5 vs 5 content, I do not suggest you take the Carrion Collar there, since there are far less chokes and grouping potential, which are really necessary to make the best use of the Morgana Raven. After all, it is a skill shot which is difficult to hit, since it's pretty narrow as well. And finally, the Infernal Sight, which I don't think many people know even exists. It's an alternative pick to the Great Axe for farming fame in strictly PvE content, but also has a slight potential to be used in PvP. The E-skill Bloody Reap deals damage twice and also applies a bleed on the first hit. However, the skill has a wind-up time, making it obvious what's about to come, and because of this, it's easy to escape from or even interrupt. You could play the Infernal Sight when fame farming solo or in fame farming groups, but it is outclassed by the Great Axe and Bear Paws. Therefore, unfortunately, this really cool looking weapon currently doesn't see much light in the world of Albion Online. So in conclusion, if you want to play a melee class that puts a ton of pressure on the enemies with bleed dots, sheer damage and heal reductions, constantly being in the midst of the enemies, the Axe weapon tree might just be the one for you. As always, do let me know what you thought of this guide, and if you have any additions to it, feel free to share them in the comments below. And if you liked this video, make sure to press that thumbs up. Next time we will go over the bow weapon tree, since you guys voted for axe and bow most, and you also pointed out that having a variety in ranged and melee at the start of the series would be a nice thing to have, which is something I completely agree with. Take care for now, and I'll see you next time.
ever got lost, you find a way to bring me home.